Picture this. It's pouring rain. You're standing deep within the dense, suffocating canopy of a Philippine jungle. The air is thick, the insects are absolutely deafening, and hidden just out of sight is a ghost. A man wearing a tattered Imperial Japanese Army uniform, gripping a meticulously maintained rifle, entirely ready for an ambush. In his mind, World War II is raging on, but in reality, the world has long since moved on. Welcome to This Explainer, where we're going to unpack one of the most astonishing, complex, and deeply tragic psychological endurance stories in human history. In 1974, a soldier walked out of a jungle still fighting World War II, 29 years after it ended. I just want to let that reality sink in for a moment. 29 years. This isn't just a basic survival story, it's a really profound study in obedience, isolation, and the terrifying power of human belief. Today, we're going to examine the complete story of Hiroo Onoda, the last man to surrender in World War II. And crucially, we're going to look at the story that almost nobody tells about the innocent people he left behind. Act 1, Orders to Never Surrender. So let's dive into who this guy actually was. Born in Wakayama in 1922, Hiroo Onoda was drafted into the Imperial Japanese Army in 1942. But he wasn't just your standard infantryman, not at all. He was sent to a highly specialized institution called the Nakano Military School. This was essentially a top-secret academy for covert operations. Here, Onoda was trained intensely in sabotage, irregular combat, and guerrilla warfare. He was taught how to operate completely alone, behind enemy lines, indefinitely. By December 1944, Second Lieutenant Onoda was deployed to a very specific remote location, Lubang Island in the Philippines. It's this small island characterized by extremely dense, unforgiving jungle terrain. Well, just 2 months after his arrival, American forces landed on Lubang. Most of the Japanese troops stationed there quickly surrendered or were killed in the fighting. But Onoda did exactly what he was trained to do. He completely vanished into the island's interior. In September 1945, Japan formally surrendered on the deck of the USS Missouri, putting an end to the deadliest conflict in human history. But Onoda wasn't there to see it. You see, right before he deployed, his commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, gave him an explicit, unbreakable command. Retreat into the island's interior. Do not surrender. Do not take your own life. It might take years, but Japan will come back for you. Under the strict, uncompromising code of the Imperial Japanese Army at the time, Onoda genuinely believed that surrendering was entirely forbidden unless he received a direct personal order from his superior officer. This single rigid command basically locked his mind in a state of permanent war. Act 2. The War That Didn't End. Now, what's really interesting is that for decades, Onoda wasn't actually alone out there in the jungle. He initially retreated with 3 companions who also missed or just flat out refused to believe the surrender. You had Yuichi Akatsu, Shoichi Shimada, and Kinshichi Kozuka. Together, they operated as this tiny, highly disciplined guerrilla unit, absolutely convinced they were holding the island for the eventual return of the Japanese Empire. And the world really tried everything to pull them out. The tragic irony here is profound when you contrast the desperate rescue attempts with their reactions. The Japanese and Philippine governments airdropped leaflets explaining the war was over. Onoda dismissed them as Allied propaganda. They dropped personal letters and family photographs. He viewed them as elaborate traps. Relatives literally stood in the jungle, using loudspeakers to beg them to come home. Onoda ignored them, firmly believing it was a cruel trick by American forces to lure them out to be executed. This brings us to a fascinating psychological phenomenon, cognitive dissonance. It's that deep psychological conflict that happens when a person's core beliefs are challenged by undeniable factual evidence. It's really crucial to understand that Onoda wasn't entirely cut off from outside information. Over the years, he actually got his hands on real newspapers and even a radio. But instead of realizing the truth, his mind actively protected his delusion. It's like a giant puzzle, and he'd only keep the pieces he wanted. He would find minor spelling errors or slightly outdated phrasing in the airdrop leaflets, and he'd use those tiny inconsistencies to basically prove to himself that the whole thing was a fabricated enemy plot. But while his mind remained frozen in 1945, the real world was taking a very real, very heavy toll on his unit. In 1950, Akatsu simply couldn't take it anymore. He walked away and surrendered. In 1954, Shimada was killed in a shootout. And finally, in October 1972, Think about that. 27 years after the war ended, Kozuka was shot and killed in a clash with local police while the pair were burning a local rice harvest. Kozuka's death actually made international headlines. Suddenly, the whole world knew a ghost from World War II was still out there, and Onoda was now completely alone. Act 3. Finding the Ghost Soldier. This is where the story shifts from a grim tale of isolated survival to literally one of the most improbable rescue missions ever launched. A young bohemian Japanese backpacker named Norio Suzuki decided he was going to travel the world, and he told his friends he was going to find 3 specific things in this exact order: Lieutenant Onoda, a panda, and the abominable snowman. I know, it sounds totally absurd, almost like a joke, but the amazing thing is Suzuki actually went to the Philippines, pitched a tent in the jungle, and incredibly, after just 4 days of searching, he came face to face with the legendary Phantom Soldier. No way, right? But it happened. But when the 2 men finally sat down and talked, Suzuki ran into a bizarre reality. Even face-to-face with a fellow countryman assuring him the war was over, the stalemate held. Onoda issued his absolute demand. He would only stand down if he received direct orders from Major Taniguchi in person. The reality, however, was that nearly 30 years had passed. Taniguchi had left the military decades ago and was now living a quiet civilian life working as a bookseller. Suzuki essentially had to hike out of the jungle and return to Japan with photographic proof just to convince the government to help him track down an aging bookseller that end a world war. Act 4. The 1974 Surrender. On March 9, 1974, the young backpacker, the aging bookseller, and the Japanese government orchestrated the final act of World War II. Major Taniguchi flew out to Lubang, put on a uniform, and walked into the dense jungle. He read the formal orders on behalf of Emperor Hirohito, officially relieving the 52-year-old soldier of his duty. Onoda stood at attention, and then he wept, uncontrollably, because after 29 years, 4 months, and 8 days, the war was finally over. The crushing weight of 3 lost decades instantly fell upon him. When he emerged from the jungle, he looked like a man completely out of time. His surrendered arsenal was just astonishing. He was still wearing his original 1944 uniform and cap. He carried a rifle that he had meticulously maintained in flawless working order for 3 decades, along with 500 rounds of ammunition and several hand grenades. But most poignantly, he handed over a small dagger his mother had given him before the war, a dagger given with the explicit instruction to end his own life if he was ever captured. It is such a stark symbol of the immense life-or-death stakes he honestly believed he was living in every single day. Onoda returned to Japan to an absolute hero's welcome. He was paraded as the ultimate symbol of traditional loyalty and discipline. But who actually paid the price for that loyalty? Act 5. The Victims Left Behind. So while this story is almost always framed as this incredible feat of endurance, we absolutely have to impartially look at the devastating human cost borne by the innocent civilians of Lubang Island. These were people who just had the horrible misfortune of living next to a man fighting a phantom war. 30. That is the estimated number of unarmed Filipino civilians killed by Onoda and his group over those 3 decades. Over 100 others were injured. To survive, Onoda's group regularly stole rice, burned harvests, and killed villagers' cattle. And when local farmers tried to protect their livelihoods or when islanders reported them to the police, Onoda's group treated them as enemy combatants. It was a deadly, entirely one-sided guerrilla war against people who were literally just trying to live their lives in peacetime. And the truly sad part is this history was almost completely erased from the popular narrative. Take, for instance, Emilio Viana. He was a 42-year-old farmer who was shot and killed while simply having lunch with his sons in 1951. Today, his relative, a filmmaker named Mia Stewart, works diligently to expose these exact truths. Yet, when Onoda surrendered, Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos quickly pardoned him without any formal investigation into these killings, a move widely seen as a diplomatic gesture toward Japan. And when Onoda published his best-selling 1974 memoir, the tragic deaths of these locals were largely glossed over, completely overshadowed by the grand narrative of his own survival. But the people of Lubang, they never forgot. The anger and the deep trauma never faded. Decades later, in 1996, when Onoda briefly returned to visit the island, he was met with intense protests. The local town council formally demanded justice, accountability, and compensation for the families of the victims. For the islanders, you have to understand, he wasn't a legendary soldier. He was a tragic, violent disruption to their community. Act 6. Life After the Jumble. So what happens to a man who finally leaves the jungle, only to find a world he literally no longer recognizes? Well, the transition was incredibly jarring for him. Unable to adapt to the fast-paced modern reality of 1970s Japanese society, he immigrated to Brazil in 1975 to run a cattle ranch. Eventually, though, he did find a way to channel his unique experiences a bit more positively. In 1984, he returned to Japan and founded the Onoda Nature School. This was a youth camp where he leveraged his immense wilderness survival skills to teach discipline and self-reliance to a whole new generation. He received various honors late in life, including a Brazilian Air Force medal, before eventually passing away from heart failure in Tokyo in 2014 at the age of 91. His legacy remains deeply fractured, to say the least. On one hand, Hiroo Onoda is immortalized as a symbol of legendary, unquestioning loyalty and almost superhuman physical and mental endurance. But on the other hand, the historical record impartially shows us a deeply tragic figure, entrenched in delusion, who waged a deadly 29-year campaign against innocent civilians long after the actual conflict was settled. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, vital thought. Hiroo Onoda wasn't fighting World War II anymore. He hadn't been for decades. He was fighting an idea he refused to let go of. For 29 years, real people paid the price for that.